Today, we'll be finding out the fascinating story of one of the most pioneering female pilots in British history. Today, we'll be talking about Amy Johnson, a record-breaking long-distance pilot, a fashion model, a vital part of the wartime efforts, and an inspiration to young women and girls across the world. We'll be taking a look at her amazing life and achievements, and the way it tragically came to an end here in Herne Bay in Kent, and the ongoing mystery that surrounds her death. And given the circumstances around her death, which we'll find out about later, it is appropriately horrible here today. So, without further ado, this is the story of Amy Johnson. Now, before we can get into the mysterious circumstances surrounding the end of her life, we would be doing her memory a huge disservice if we didn't go through everything she accomplished. And I think in order to do that, there are some little bits and pieces from her earlier life that we can look at that led to everything she did later on. So, Amy Johnson. Where did she begin? Well, she had a reasonably humble upbringing. She was born in Hull to a mother and father, and she was one or the eldest of 4 sisters. And in Hull, her father actually ran a fish import and export business. And you might think, that's probably about as far away from aviation as you could hope to start. How do you go from a family with connections in big fish to one of the most pioneering aviators in history? But her father's money and connections did open up certain possibilities for her that not every woman in the 1920s had available to them. And that first opportunity that she had to branch out and take a step away from that family life, away from Hull, was she went to university, and specifically she went to the University of Sheffield. And no, she did not go there to study aviation or engineering. She actually went to Sheffield University to study Latin, French, and economics. But during that time, she did actually manage to attend some engineering lectures. And it was those engineering lectures that really started her on her path skyward. And it's quite nice actually looking at Sheffield University, despite the fact that she didn't actually do the specific training that would lead to her future success. The university does still commemorate her. There is the Amy Johnson building, which is the home of, let me get this right, the university's Department of Automatic Control and Systems Engineering. And there are actually a series of scholarships available at the university aimed at getting more women into engineering, which is really good. And on completing her course at Sheffield, she decided to move to London. It's clear that even in the 1920s, it was still incredibly common for university graduates to finish and immediately go to London to make their fame and fortune, and ultimately probably just end up in recruitment. Not that that's what I did. But it wasn't only ambition and the desire to leave what she often described as the freezing north. It was a relationship that encouraged her to flee to London. And I think any of us who've been to university were either well aware of or actually had some very toxic university relationships. Relationships that were doomed to never actually make it past graduation. Leave a comment if you have any interesting university relationship stories that you want to share. In fact, we actually have access to a lot of Amy's letters to her family and friends. And there's actually an interesting quote from one of those letters to a friend about said relationship. This is Amy writing on the 10th of June, 1926, age 22.
Hans is the most despicable creature I ever knew. He's a pig, an absolute pig, and I can't believe I ever loved him.
That same letter also reveals clear early signs that Amy was never content with living a typical 1920s woman's life. And it also reveals that she's deep in debt from buying, and I quote, too many new clothes and books. So clearly, even in the 1920s, students couldn't resist spending their tuition fees on anything but their tuition. And the graduates out there will also find her post-uni London experience quite familiar. She clearly loved London life. She often talked about parties and the hubbub and how there was so much going on in London. But she was still clearly suffering from the expectations she felt as a woman of her age in the 1920s and the expectations that were being maybe placed unfairly on her by her parents. In fact, it was very clear from her letters that the relationship with her parents was a bit of a strained one, and that they weren't necessarily happy that she wasn't necessarily living the life of a safe, secure 1920s housewife. In London, she briefly, very briefly, worked in retail, which again, a lot of graduates out there will understand. And after leaving that job that she really disliked, she actually ended up working as a typist for a firm of solicitors. And in her letters, she talks about how she thinks she may have finally found a career that suits her and something proper, a real job. It didn't take long though before that brief glimpse she had at university of engineering and a life of working with your hands clearly started to eat away at her. And she finally snapped one Sunday afternoon and found the nearest thing that offered her a window back into that world, which she described in the following excerpt from a letter to her sister Irene.
And then there are the aeroplanes. Yes, aeroplanes. The drone of them thrums overhead all day long. I find myself darting for the window for a glimpse whenever one goes over. It turns out we're quite near some airfield. It drives everyone else mad. Why live here then? But I like it. There's something quite comforting about it. It reminds me of the war. Do you remember that time the Zeps were going over and I ran outside to have a look? Dad dragged me back into the cellar so fast. You were so surprised you fell in the coal bunker. I remember seeing a film at the cinema of a plane soaring amongst the clouds. Were you with me? I don't remember. I just remember thinking, what must it be like to be so free of everything? So at home, with the sky and the wind, the whole of the world at your feet. Something about the sound of the planes fills me with a burning desire to get up there myself. One day last week, I couldn't stand it any longer. I thought I'd go mad if I stayed indoors, listening to planes zoom by. So I got on a bus and went up to the airfield myself, Stag Lane. It was quite wonderful. Planes taking off and landing and doing turns in the air, and people sat in deck chairs watching. I joined in. I felt I couldn't exactly describe how I felt, except it felt like home. Does that make sense? It sounds awfully silly now I write it. Anyway, I ended up asking about having flying lessons, just for the thrill of it. The club's secretary said I have to pay for membership and then wait for a vacancy. I'm all paid up, so now it's just a waiting game.
Amy actually applying for flying lessons was incredibly unusual in the 1920s. It was not something that women did, and in fact, there were barely a handful of women who were actually trained pilots. And most of those were titled women, women from families that had money and status. There was Lady Heath, the Duchess of Bedford, and Lady Bailey. But Amy managed to gain a ground engineer's C licence with financial help from her father, and the flying lessons began. Describing these heady days in another letter to her sister Irene, Amy said,
I'm quite the novelty at the airfield, a female pilot. Some of the men look at me crossly as if to say, look at her, what does she think she is? I just smile and think quietly, I'll show them. A woman can do anything you can do just as well, if not better.
And in 1929, she was awarded her pilot's license. Here from a letter to her friend on the 4th of August 1929.
I've passed my pilot's A certificate. That means I'm qualified to fly all types of flying machine. Finally, I flew solo for the first time last month. It was like nothing I'd ever known. It's real. Just you and the controls and endless skies beckoning you to play. I can't get enough.
In that same letter to her friend, she also reveals that despite early skepticism, she's actually starting to improve her relationship with the other ground engineers and mechanics and pilots at the airfield.
They call me Johnny, like I really am one of them. They call me the platinum blonde too, as I've dyed my hair, but I prefer John.
And here is where we also find out where the first spark of an idea about the accomplishment that will make her famous comes from.
Captain Baker told me I'd have to earn my spurs if I want to fly. When I asked him what he meant, he grinned and said I'd have to fly solo to Australia or something. Australia? I told him straight that's already been done, as if he didn't know. Bert Hinkler set the record last year, just 15.5 days. Baker pointed out a woman hasn't done it, but is that enough? There's no point doing something just for the sake of it, just because you're a woman. No, if I wanted to do it, I'd have to beat Hinkler's record. Can you imagine? A record-breaking aviatrix. I like the sound of that.
The spark that would ignite the feat that would bring her fame and legacy had been ignited, and her training went full steam ahead. Then, just as things were starting to pick up in Amy's life, tragedy struck. That same year, 1929, her sister Irene, who she had written so passionately to, committed suicide. And since we're touching on the subject, anybody who is having suicidal thoughts, anyone who is struggling at the moment, and it can be any of us, it can happen to literally anyone, doesn't matter what's happening in your life, it's so important to reach out to somebody. And there are services and charities whose entire point is to be there for vulnerable people who are having these kinds of thoughts. So I'll provide links in the description to some of those organisations. Let's carry on. Irene's death had a huge impact on Amy and her family. And the stigma around suicide was obviously much worse in the 1920s. For Amy, it could have sent her one of two ways. It could have forced her to abandon everything in London and go back to Hull, or it could set her on a path to not let anything get in the way of what she was starting to achieve with her flying. And for Amy, being as driven as she was, she chose the latter. After Irene's funeral, she wrote this in a letter to her father.
Flying is everything to me. It's my entire world. I don't want to worry you, but I must carry on, or I don't know what I'll do. Now Renee is gone, it's even more important that I continue. Flying is all I have. It scares me too sometimes. I'll tell you a story, not because I want to frighten you, but because I want you to understand how I feel.
Here is where we get into a particularly ominous piece of foreshadowing of how Amy would ultimately meet her fate.
Last year, just after I'd got my A certificate, I went out to do my first solo cross-country. Everything went as normal until suddenly I realised I was lost. I was heading through the cloud belt and had no idea where I was. I kept dipping lower to see if I could recognise something, but everything looked the same. From the green fields to the little roads, chasing from house to house. I managed to make an emergency landing, but it shook me up. And even though I made sure I never neglected navigation again, it's haunted me ever since. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, breathless and shivering, and I'm back there, trapped forever just below the clouds, circling desperately, looking for something, anything I recognise. But I never find anything. I never see another soul.
Again here, Amy goes on to use that dream to continue driving her towards her ultimate goal.
I have realised that in that dream, that nightmare, I never find anything on the ground because the thing I'm looking for is flying itself. It's my little biplane and me, dancing in the clouds, not needing anyone else. Please don't fear for me. Just think of me riding high above the clouds, darting between mountains in the sky and banking here and there on the most glorious adventure of my life. I think that's how I should like to be remembered, if I ever am. Soaring above the world, quite alone, quite free, quite at peace.
The following year, she began making plans for her flight to Australia. Now, Amy was clearly still making waves in the world of aviation, and because of everything she was doing, she began to garner a certain amount of attention. And she very clearly struggled with the pressure and the idea that she was just a girl who didn't belong anywhere near an airfield or anywhere near planes. And she was worried she'd be remembered as, and I quote, the girl who flew too close to the sun. And despite all of her efforts to make this about a woman who was pushing boundaries and doing anything a man could do and doing it better, the papers and the media were still treating her as something of a novelty. And despite the fact that her trip to Australia was meticulously planned, with plenty of safety precautions in place, and every stop planned out exactly, papers like the Daily Mail were still coming out with statements and headlines like, she'd set off to Australia with a cupboard full of frocks, not particularly helping the situation or what Amy was trying to achieve. For the flight, because obviously this was an effort not just to get to Australia, but also to beat the current world record, Amy chose a very daring, bold way to plan her trip there. She literally took a ruler and placed it on a map from London to Australia, as the crow flies. Then along the route she found and plotted the various different airfields she could use to stop and refuel along the way. But because she had chosen this route, it didn't really allow for sections that most pilots would look at and go, I'm not going to be able to land anywhere near here for hours. I'm going to go round. So she was flying over some incredibly inhospitable terrain. And because a lot of these places had nowhere to land, it meant she was stuck in an open cockpit for at least 8 hours a flight. It also meant that she could not afford to miss a fuel stop. We also have to remember that this is the 1920s and she's flying in a biplane. She didn't have radio, safety equipment. She had a parachute, but that was about it as far as safety equipment came, although she was taught jiu-jitsu just in case she landed somewhere and had to fend for herself. She would also have no reliable weather information. She was traveling with very basic maps. In fact, some of the land that she was going to be flying over was completely uncharted, so if she crashed somewhere, she might not have a clue where she was. Let's remember, she's taking on this gargantuan challenge after the longest solo flight she's ever done was London to Hull. Australia was literally the other side of the planet. The plane that Amy would be flying was a reliable second-hand gypsy moth that she affectionately called Jason. And believe you me, when you look at this plane, you too will wonder, how did she make it to Australia in that? Boarding Jason at Croydon Airport on the 5th of May 1930, there was a little fanfare, but not a huge turnout to see her head off. The first 6 days of her flight were actually relatively straightforward, although she did end up getting caught in a sandstorm in the Iraq desert and making an emergency landing there. But despite that, she made it to India in those 6 days and broke her first record with that part of the journey. This record-breaking achievement at the beginning of her journey actually forced the press and other people to start paying attention to what she was doing. Everybody started taking her a little more seriously. She also scared the bejesus out of an Indian Army garrison when she landed on their parade ground. Everything continued smoothly again from that point until she reached Myanmar, or as it was known then, Burma. And having spent some time living in Asia, I can tell you the weather is not to be messed with. And Amy was caught in a monsoon. Not something you would want to be caught in a modern day plane, let alone an open-topped biplane. Amy was completely exposed to the elements. And because of this, when she made an attempted landing outside Rangoon, Amy's landings were often described as a little bumpy, by herself as well. She ended up ripping a hole in Jason's wing and damaging the propeller. This was obviously a major hiccup in the record attempt, and the plane needed to be repaired, which fortunately a local technical institute managed to do. And they actually fixed the hole in the wing by unpicking shirts that had been made using aeroplane fabric from the First World War. Unfortunately, despite the fix, the Myanmar delay was what forced Amy to miss out on the chance to break that record that had already been set. Nevertheless, on the 24th of May 1930, she landed in Darwin in northern Australia to crowds and crowds of admirers. All in all, she had travelled 11,000 miles, or 18,000 kilometres, solo in an open-topped biplane. She had done it. She'd missed out on the record, but that's not what mattered. She had shown that a woman could do anything a man could do. Amy's life had changed forever. Everybody wanted to interview her. Women wanted her haircut. People wrote songs about her. She inspired films. One hilarious little note is that people were writing fan mail to her, and a letter managed to reach her from a fan who had addressed his letter simply to Amy, what flies in England, and it actually reached her. Jason himself had become part of history too, and he's actually still on display at the Science Museum in London. The achievement also gained her the Harmon Trophy, and she was mentioned in the King's Honours, awarded a CBE by King George V. And that was it for Amy. She couldn't go back to a normal life, and her flight to Australia kicked off a series of high-flying record attempts. In 1931, she and her co-pilot Jack Humphreys broke the record for a flight to Moscow from London. The 1,760-mile trip took them only 21 hours. They were flying a de Havilland DH-80 Puss Moth, and she affectionately named it Jason 2. They then continued across Siberia, and in doing so, went on to set the record for a flight from Britain to Japan. In 1932, all eyes were clearly still on Amy, including those of Scottish pilot Jim Mollison. Jim Mollison was clearly a very confident man, and during their first flight together, 8 hours after they'd first met, he proposed, and they very quickly became known as the Flying Sweethearts. They were quickly married, and that didn't stop the record attempts from coming. Later that same year, Amy set another record for a solo flight from London to Cape Town, and actually broke her new husband's record in doing so. Sure, that went down well on the honeymoon. The following year, 1933, the couple decided to try and break a record for a cross-Atlantic flight from London to New York. This journey was a very, very risky one. Risky because, for the vast majority of the flight, you're flying over the Atlantic Ocean, which means two things. One, there's nowhere to stop for fuel, so you have to carry all of that flammable fuel with you. And B, there's nowhere to land. And by the time they were approaching the end of this flight, they were running desperately low on fuel. And flying in the dark, they spotted the lights of Bridgeport Municipal Airport. And being in the situation they were in, they decided to make an early landing. They actually ended up circling the airport 5 times, trying to see if they could land, but that just burnt through the remaining fuel they had, and they ended up crashing just outside the airport in a drainage ditch. Both Amy and Jim were thrown from the aeroplane, but only suffered minor cuts and grazes. But despite just failing to make their ultimate goal of New York, they'd made it to America, and they were treated like heroes. In fact, President Roosevelt even entertained them with a ticker tape parade to celebrate their accomplishment. The following year, the record attempts continued, and they decided to try and fly the New de Havilland Comet in the Britain to Australia McRobertson Air Race. They were unfortunately, however, despite breaking the record for a London to India flight, again in Amy's case, they were forced to retire from the race due to engine trouble, and they finished in Allahabad. Her fame was still continuing to grow in 1934, and she actually became the youngest president of the Women's Engineering Society. Then, in 1936, came her last record attempt. She once again decided to do her flight from London to South Africa, and flying a Percival Gull 6, she managed to regain the record she'd set 2 years earlier. After she decided to kind of take a step away from all the record attempts, clearly all these long-haul flights were beginning to take their toll, she continued to hone her gliding talents. She seemed to really love taking part in gliding, and was a hugely active member of her gliding club until the outbreak of the Second World War put a halt to all gliding in Britain. She also had a bit of an upset in 1938 in her glider, when on landing during a display, she managed to overturn her glider. Again, landing was never her best talent. Fortunately, she wasn't seriously hurt, and remaining ever jovial, she stated, "I still declare that gliding is the safest form of flying." And speaking of bad landings, 1937 was clearly a bit of a year of upheaval for Amy Johnson, because she also divorced Jim Mollison and reverted back to her maiden name. At the same time, it was also becoming clear that record breaking was becoming a harder and harder task. As aeroplane technology was increasing and improving exponentially, you couldn't just hop in a biplane and break a record just like that anymore. So Amy decided it was about time to branch out and not keep all of her eggs in one basket. And to do that, she decided to try and utilize the fame that she'd found through her record attempts. She turned to different business ventures, journalism, and even fashion. And she actually started to do some modeling and created the Amy Johnson traveling bag. But the outbreak of the war in 1939 changed things once again, and Amy took back to the skies to try and help out however she could. Ultimately, she found work flying for the Portsmouth, South Sea, and Isle of Wight Aviation Company, and she started embarking on short flights across the Solent as a target, a training target, for the searchlight batteries and anti-aircraft guns that were being set up along the south coast. And this must have been invaluable training for the operators of those anti-aircraft batteries and searchlight batteries, knowing what was going to come across the English Channel in the years that followed. Then, in 1940, all of Johnson's employers' aircraft were taken over by the Air Ministry. Now this made sense. They needed the planes for the war effort, and the country was in the process of taking everything it could get towards that end. But what it did mean is that Johnson and every other pilot she worked with was made redundant, and all she was given as a redundancy package was 1 week's pay plus a further 4 weeks' pay, which totaled to the staggering amount of 40 quid, which in today's money amounted to about £2,800. So it was pretty clear that Johnson was going to have to find something else, and she wasn't going to let something silly like a world war stop her from flying. And 2 months later, she joined the ATA, or the Air Transport Auxiliary. In the ATA, she wasn't exactly going to be heading off and getting involved in dogfights over the British Channel, but she would get to fly the planes. Her role would be transporting Royal Air Force aircraft around the country. And it seemed like she had a great time doing this. She worked her way up through the ranks to first officer. She was actually under the command of another woman, Pauline Gower, who was a good friend of hers. And Jim Mollison, her former, now ex-husband, was also part of the ATA and flew missions for them during the war. Johnson actually described a typical day in the life of a woman in the ATA in a humorous article that was published posthumously in the 1941 edition of the Woman Engineer Journal.
Miss X hastily puts on her navy uniform, slacks, military tunic, forage cap and overcoat, pausing just long enough before the mirror to admire her 2 new gold stripes. She is now a first officer and is qualified to fly a great many more types of plane than, alas, her employers, British Overseas Airways Corporation, under whose aegis the ATA has its being, will allow. All single-engine service types and light multi-engine trainers is the caption on her CFS report. However, no use wasting time sighing over the hurricanes and Spitfires she's not permitted to handle. Rather is she grateful for the enormous privileges she has so far gained. From the light training mechanics like Moth and Aviation she flew before the war at her loyal flying club, she has been converted to fast, modern types with hundreds of knobs and complications.
That humorous article potentially giving us an idea of the somewhat different circumstances Johnson had found herself in. Then, on the 5th of January 1941, it all came to an end. Right, I am here in Herne Bay. It's horrible, and we are going to try and find the statue of Amy Johnson. This better be worth it. If you've seen my video on the sinking of the Northfleet, I went to Dungeness, and the weather is always grim in Dungeness. This is worse. Well, here she is, Amy Johnson. The statue was commissioned by the Amy Johnson Project back in 2016 and designed by Stephen Melton, who's a local artist based in Ramsgate. And interestingly, there's actually a second identical statue up in her hometown in Hull. And both statues have her quotes inscribed on them. And they were put here to celebrate the 75th anniversary of her death. And it's quite nice to see her still staring off into the sky. There are also some other statues whose purpose is slightly less clear. On January the 5th, 1941, sailors on board the HMS Haslemere, which was just off Herne Bay that day, witnessed a parachutist emerging from the clouds. The parachutist was swiftly followed by a plane that seemed under control but was making slow circles down until it crashed into the freezing cold waters below. The parachutist was then also seen landing in the water, and when sailors tried to get a better look, they noticed the helmeted, fresh-faced parachutist in the water drifting towards the Haslemere, along with several other objects, one of which looked like another pilot. Through the awful conditions, sailors also claimed to have heard a high-pitched voice scream, "Hurry, please, hurry." But before the pilot could be saved, They drifted past and disappeared under the stern of the ship, never to be seen again. Earlier that same day, Johnson took off on what was supposed to be a routine flight, taking a plane from one airport to another. The flight itself was supposed to be a routine 90-minute flight from Blackpool Aerodrome to RAF Kidlington near Oxford. But 4 hours later, Amy Johnson found herself parachuting into the Thames estuary here in Herne Bay. The captain of the Haslemere, a Captain Fletcher, actually dived into the water despite the horrendous conditions and started making his way to what was thought to be the second pilot. He was seen struggling but failing to grab hold of the second person in the water. Despite being an incredibly strong swimmer, Captain Fletcher couldn't quite save the person he saw in the water, and unfortunately died of hypothermia after the rescue attempt. It was that cold in the water, and even more tragically, as no evidence of a second airman was ever found, it's highly likely that the figure Captain Fletcher tried to save that day was probably nothing more than Amy Johnson's leather bag. He was posthumously awarded for his ultimate sacrifice and his honourable attempt at saving what he thought was a person in the water. As for the other pilot who disappeared beneath the Haslemere, that was almost certainly Amy Johnson. She was presumed drowned, and her body has never been recovered. All that was found was a travelling bag, logbook and checkbook, along with some small parts of debris from the plane. So Amy, to this day, is still somewhere out there in the freezing waters of the Thames estuary. What she was doing here, 4 hours after turning off, is unclear, though it quite likely was something to do with the conditions on the day, because it was horrible. And it's quite likely that she ran out of fuel, didn't know where she was, and had to bail out. The idea, however, that she ran out of fuel and found herself here, way off course, is contested by a lot of historians, given the wealth of experience she had flying long distances. And that is what has led to a myriad of other theories as to why she was here on the Kent coast. Now, the mystery surrounding this whole event is quite understandable. There are a few things that confuse the picture and make this not necessarily the most straightforward accident to explain. The first piece of information that confused the picture was the fact that this was supposed to be a very straightforward 90-minute flight. And 4 hours after she left Blackpool, she was nowhere near where she was supposed to be in Oxford. In fact, it looks more like she just followed the coast. Now, the most straightforward explanation for how she ended up in the completely wrong place 4 hours later, clearly running out of fuel, was the weather conditions. It was foggy, snowy, freezing. These were perfect conditions for an aircraft to get completely lost in. And we only have to think back to the nightmare that Amy Johnson described to her father of coming down below the clouds and not having a clue where she was. This is exactly what could have happened. Johnson became lost in the conditions in an unfamiliar plane and decided to try and find what landmarks she could to try and find somewhere that she knew. And that's how she ended up following the coastline. She then spent simply far too long trying to get her bearings and ended up in a position where she was running out of fuel and had no option but to bail out of the aircraft. This, however, has been contested by many historians, and given Amy's wealth of experience flying long distance, it does seem odd that she would struggle in what was supposed to be a 90-minute flight. But again, going back to that clearly traumatic dream, that traumatic early experience she had, and in those horrible conditions, it's not difficult to imagine somebody losing their head. It can happen to the best of us, no matter how much experience you have. And you add on to that the stress of flying during the war. I don't think it's as implausible as some historians make it out to be. Another potential reason, given for her being so far off course, was Amy was flying a secret mission for the British government overseas to Europe. And even more credence was given to this, given the confusion over whether there were 1 or 2 pilots in the water. This rather fanciful theory then led to another theory that she could have been shot down by enemy fighters. Sorties by the enemy over British territory were quite common at the time, so not unreasonable to think that another plane, a German plane, could have flown over and shot her down, and potentially were chasing her back from Europe. Again, a slightly more exciting explanation, but not necessarily one based in fact. I don't think we have any witnesses claiming that they saw Messerschmitts following her. Another theory that actually might have some more credence, we at least have a potentially credible witness here, is that it was actually friendly fire that shot down her plane. More than 50 years after the incident, a former soldier, now retired gardener, came forward, racked with guilt, to claim that he was one of 4 soldiers who mistook Amy's plane for an enemy and shot her down. His name was Tom Mitchell, and he was stationed at the Thames Estuary Gun Battery. He claimed that as she was flying by, she twice failed to make the correct signal, letting them know she was a friendly. And so, taking no chances during the war, they shot her down. In an article that was posted in The Guardian back in 1999, Mitchell said the following: 16 rounds of shells were fired, and the plane dived into the Thames estuary. We all thought it was an enemy plane, until the next day when we read the papers and discovered it was Amy. The officers told us never to tell anyone what happened. This sounds like a cut and dry, well, there you go, that's what happened. But historians looking at what happened, where the plane came down, where the Haslemere was, where the gun battery was, claim that the gun battery was too far away to have successfully shot down the plane. And we also have to take into account the huge amount of time passed between the incident and the revelation, and how much could have been muddled in that time. You can easily see how one could convince themselves over decades that they were responsible. And there are many cases during the Second World War, during any war, of friendly fire. It's not impossible, it does happen. Then 17 years later, there was another potential revelation, not necessarily about how the plane came down, but more specifically about how Amy died. A Hull historian, Dr. Alec Gill, claimed that there had been a cover-up by the Royal Navy. Another one of our HMS Haslemere witnesses claimed that as the boat was slowed down to try and rescue Johnson, its propellers were reversed, and that this actually resulted in Amy Johnson being sucked into the propellers of the HMS Haslemere. Gill himself said, "This ship should have gone down in history as the vessel that saved her life. Instead, historians are now beginning to conclude that the propellers of the Haslemere killed her." This is where Gill also claims that her death was covered up. The Royal Navy did not want to admit to the Royal Air Force, or indeed a nation at war, that they had killed Britain's favourite female pilot. It's likely that we will never know the complete truth. And as there was no body ever recovered, there was never an official inquest. And as it was during wartime, she was simply listed as missing rather than dead. And the RAF accident record card simply lists Herne Bay as the location of Amy's final flight. So what really happened that day? As with any mystery, we're presented with multiple theories, multiple witnesses, different ideas. of what might have happened, none of which have any strong evidence to back them up. So all we're left with is what is our common sense feeling about what might have happened. And I think when you add together the terrible conditions of the day, yes, she was an incredible pilot, but it was awful. And if you're overtired, if you stop concentrating for even a few seconds, a few minutes up there, it is so easy to become disoriented, especially in conditions like that. And I can see how she could have ended up circling for the 4 hours it took her to run out of fuel. And in those conditions, having no choice but to give up and abandon her plane. What happened in the water, not going to make much of a difference either way. In those conditions, she was not going to survive long. Whether she accidentally ended up under the HMS Haslemere or not, as soon as she hit that water, her chances of survival were next to nothing. So that's what I believe. You can understand though how, especially in wartime, some of the more fanciful stories of being mistaken for an enemy plane and shot down in a friendly fire incident, or flying some clandestine mission to Europe, you can see how appealing those theories might be. But as with everything, Occam's razor, whatever seems the simplest answer is usually the truth. As for tributes, her full name, Amy V. Johnson, is carved within the Commonwealth War Graves Commission Air Force's memorial, which is in Surrey. Her name is among thousands of other names for those who flew in the Air Force during the Second World War who have no known grave. Now, despite this tragic and potentially mysterious end to Amy Johnson's life, there are so many more things that she did that shouldn't be overshadowed by the way her life ended. She was such a pioneer and such a driving force for young girls and women, not just in Britain, but around the world. And it is clear from everything she said, everything she wrote in her letters, that she was determined to make a difference for women in the world, and to prove that they were just as capable, if not more so, than men. The fact that her influence is still being felt to this day just goes to show how successful she actually was, and that in setting out to achieve her dreams, she 100% succeeded. Decades on from her life and death, we still remember her achievements and we celebrate her, and that's clear to see here in Herne Bay still today in 2024.
I think that's how I should like to be remembered, if I ever am. Soaring above the world, quite alone, quite free, quite at peace.
So on that note, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Me and Amy put a lot of work into this one. And if you did enjoy it, sorry, it's really cold, it's hard for me to speak. Tell me what you think really happened. How did she end up in Herne Bay? How did the plane come down? What do you think really happened that day? Comment, like, subscribe, all the usual stuff. It really helps me out, and I'll see you in the next one.